Sometimes it's not the loudest voice that wins the room. Sometimes it's the one who waits, who listens, and then speaks with the weight of truth, not volume. But what happens when confidence is built on assumptions, and someone finally calls the bluff? The lights were too bright, the kind of bright that made everyone look just a little more polished than real life. Cameras rolled silently as producers behind glass walls gave hand signals and whispered countdowns into headsets. A red live icon flickered in the corner of the monitor. And there she was, Jessica Tarlov, legs crossed, eyes steady, smirk in place. She leaned back in her chair, one hand holding a pen she rarely used, the other resting near her mic, that poised like she'd done this 100 times before. Because she had. To the audience, Jessica was the embodiment of confidence. She'd built her entire brand on being sharp, fast, and fiercely unbothered. When Jessica was on screen, she didn't just make points, she scored them. Her Ivy League credentials gave her credibility. Her wit made her entertaining. But tonight, she didn't know she was walking into a storm she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. Across from her sat Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana, folksy, deliberate, and with a drawl that many mistook for distraction. They shouldn't have. He'd spent decades in public service, and beneath the slow-spoken charm was a mind that could outmaneuver a policy paper without raising his voice. Tonight he was the guest conservatives quietly hoped would hold his own, and liberals assumed would be easy to dismiss. The segment began like any other. The panel opened with broad strokes on inflation, then pivoted, as panels always do, toward border security, the topic guaranteed to ignite sparks. The moderator, eyes flitting from cue cards to panelists, turned to Kennedy and said, "Senator, you've been vocal about the failures of the current administration's border strategy. What's your take?" Kennedy nodded slightly and adjusted his microphone. "Well," he began, "when you invite chaos, you get chaos. Our southern border's not a policy disagreement anymore. It's a humanitarian tragedy." He continued, outlining numbers, costs, facts, slowly but thoroughly. No sensationalism, just steady concern. But Jessica, who had remained quiet for exactly 38 seconds, couldn't help herself. "I'm sorry, Senator," she interrupted, eyebrows lifted with theatrical empathy. "Do you actually read the legislation you vote on, or do you just skim the Fox News homepage before casting your ballot?" A collective gasp rolled through the studio, not loud but unmistakable. Someone in the back even let out a half-suppressed "oh." On another show, it might have been a punchline, but here in this moment it landed like a slap. The moderator stiffened. The makeup artist backstage dropped her powder puff. One of the camera operators slowly zoomed in, sensing the moment might spiral. Kennedy paused mid-sentence. He didn't frown. He didn't flinch. He blinked once. Then he leaned forward, just enough to close the distance. Not physically, but intellectually. "Well," he said, his voice thick like warm molasses, "I read 'em real slow, every word. And I reckon that's why I know spin when I see it and bias when I hear it." Jessica laughed, short and sharp. It wasn't amusement. It was dismissal. "Spin? Senator, your party runs on grievance and gerrymandering. Let's not pretend you're a neutral observer here." It should have ended there. A quip met with a rebuttal, and then on to the next panelist. That's how these shows usually go. But this time something shifted. Not in what was said, but in what wasn't. Kennedy said nothing. And yet the room began to change. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels full, like thunder waiting to clap. And in that silence, Jessica began to lose her footing, not because of what Kennedy said, but because of what he didn't say. He wasn't pausing because he was stumped. He was pausing because he was choosing his moment. He'd been underestimated before, often. People hear his southern drawl and imagine a rocking chair on a porch, not Harvard law and a Senate record filled with floor speeches and amendments. But Kennedy had learned a long time ago that people who talk fast often think sloppy, and people who interrupt usually aren't listening. That break before commercial felt like a breath held too long, and the producers knew what they had, something rare. The tension wasn't a glitch, it was gold. Back from break, the moderator tried to reset the tone, offering a tight smile as the camera cut back to the round table. "Well, things got a little lively before the break. Senator Kennedy, would you like to respond?" Kennedy didn't jump in. He didn't grab the mic. He picked up his pen. clicked it once, and then set it gently on the table. He turned to Jessica, slowly. "Miss Tarlov," he said, "you're real quick with those Ivy League digs. And I get it. I talk slow, so you figure I must think slow too. But since we're tossing shade, let me say this real slow in case you'd like to take notes." Jessica's smile faltered. The air, already heavy, pressed tighter. "You mentioned grievance politics and gerrymandering like they're disqualifiers. But bless your heart. If there's anyone at this table reciting pre-approved talking points from a teleprompter, it sure as sin ain't me." A quiet could be heard from somewhere off camera. "I've read the bills. I've written a few. I've debated them in rooms you've never stepped foot in. And while you were rehearsing zingers for this show, some of us were doing the work, quietly, thoroughly, and in plain damn English." Jessica opened her mouth, but Kennedy raised a single finger. "Let me finish." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't loud. It was simply final. This ain't about party lines anymore. It's about the smugness of people who think intelligence only comes with a 5-syllable vocabulary and a zip code north of Virginia. Newsflash, Miss Tarlov, the Founding Fathers didn't speak in think tank lingo. They spoke with conviction, and they'd have sniffed out this elitist charade in 2 minutes flat. Jessica glanced at the moderator, hoping, perhaps subconsciously, for a lifeline. But no help came. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, the fire in his words now tempered with something else. Calm. "I may talk slow," he said, "but I don't think slow. And if you mistake humility for ignorance, that ain't my education failing me. That's yours." And just like that, the studio was silent. Dead silent. Not because the conversation was over, but because it had just begun in a whole new register. People at home didn't change the channel. They leaned forward. Kids wandered in from other rooms. Twitter lit up, not with outrage, but with reverence, because something rare had just happened on live TV. Something honest. Something human. The rest of the segment blurred. Other panelists tried to pivot, but the tone had shifted, and everyone knew it. Jessica, to her credit, didn't fire back. She sat a little straighter, her arms folded tighter, her smile never returned. She'd miscalculated, and she knew it. That night, the clip exploded. But it wasn't the soundbite that went viral. It was the silence. The way Kennedy had wielded it like a weapon, a shield, and a sermon all at once. He hadn't tried to destroy her. He'd simply refused to let her definition of smart go unchallenged. And maybe that's what made it land so deeply. In a world addicted to noise, a single moment of calm confidence stood taller than all the shouting combined. And that was just the beginning. The lights didn't change, but the atmosphere had. The moment Kennedy finished his final line, "That's your education failing you, not mine," the studio's energy dropped into a deep, almost reverent stillness. Jessica Tarlov sat with her arms crossed, the practiced smile nowhere to be seen. Her eyes scanned the room not with defiance, but with something else. Recalibration. She'd been in countless debates. She knew how to win an argument, knew how to pivot, jab, reset, charm, but none of those tactics had prepared her for this. Because this wasn't a political skirmish. This was a slow, surgical dismantling, and Kennedy hadn't even raised his voice. Somewhere backstage, a junior producer mouthed to a colleague, "Did that just happen?" It had, and it wasn't over. The moderator, clearly trying to smooth the edges, turned the conversation toward healthcare, hoping a change of subject might loosen the tension. But it didn't. The air in the room had thickened. Even the most media-trained panelists hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether their next sentence might be weighed and found wanting. Jessica tried to recover. It was subtle at first. A few nods, a measured laugh at another panelist's comment. But the spark that had lit her earlier zinger was gone. And when she finally spoke again, her tone was lighter, but not natural. "Well," she said, forcing a chuckle, "I think the viewers can decide whether quoting the Founding Fathers in a healthcare debate is wisdom or just nostalgic theatre." A decent line. Under normal circumstances, it might have landed, but not here. Not now. Because Kennedy hadn't just quoted history to sound grand. He'd invoked it to expose a deeper truth. That elitism doesn't always arrive with a sneer. Sometimes it arrives dressed as insight, masking condescension with polish. Kennedy gave her a long look. Then, in that same composed voice that had already shifted the room's gravity, he said, "Sure, let the viewers decide. But before they do, I'd like to help them see clearly. And then from inside his blazer pocket he pulled out a piece of paper. Real paper. Folded. Highlighted. Annotated. The kind of thing no one brings on live television anymore. I brought receipts, he said, flatly. Jessica's eyes widened, just slightly. You could miss it if you blinked, but the camera didn't blink. Kennedy unfolded the page with the patience of a man who knew time was on his side. You mentioned Section 34B of the border relief proposal earlier, he said, pointing to a highlighted line. You claimed it authorized federal agents to circumvent state oversight. That's false. Line 12 explicitly states the opposite. Enforcement requires joint state-federal coordination. Would you like me to read it aloud? He paused, not to provoke, but to invite clarity. Jessica didn't respond. She didn't need to. The audience was responding for her, in their living rooms behind their screens. Kennedy continued, flipping the page. You also said the provision defunded local municipalities. But here, under subsection 3, it clearly earmarks $28 million in grant support to county-level law enforcement. Again, I've highlighted it for you. No anger, no mockery, just facts, presented with surgical calm. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even particularly dramatic. It was, in a strange way, beautiful. Like watching a craftsman repair something others had only ever tried to break. Jessica blinked fast. A subtle tell. Her foot tapped once under the desk, then stopped. She crossed and uncrossed her legs. Small gestures, but the audience was watching everything now. You could almost feel the neurons firing across the country. People didn't just watch Kennedy, they learned from him. That's what made the difference. Because this wasn't just a takedown, it was a masterclass. And then he said something that cemented the entire shift. You called my intelligence into question, Jessica. That's fine. Happens all the time when folks don't like what I say, but can't prove it wrong. So instead of debating substance, they go after how I sound, my accent, my age, where I'm from. He looked directly into the camera now. I've spent a lifetime in rooms where people assumed I was the least educated person there, until I started talking. Then they started leaving. Even the moderator looked away. That line didn't land like a jab, it landed like a confession, one heard and shared by every viewer who's ever been underestimated because of the way they spoke, where they came from, or what they didn't wear on their sleeves. Jessica adjusted her mic. It wasn't broken, but it looked broken. Kennedy folded the paper and placed it on the table like a teacher placing a graded exam in front of a student who just learned they'd flunked it. The segment moved on, but the moment did not. After the broadcast, social media erupted, but unlike most post-debate buzz, this wasn't a brawl of outrage and counter-outrage. It was quieter, sharper, more reflective. Clips of Kennedy's calm dismantling were edited into TikToks. People added captions like, open quote, he didn't argue, he taught. This is what grace under fire looks like. I talk slow, but I don't think slow. Close quote. The quote took off. It was printed on T-shirts by the end of the night, used in classroom discussions by the end of the week. In barbershops, diners, and quiet kitchen tables, people weren't just repeating what Kennedy said, they were claiming it, internalizing it. I may talk slow, but I don't think slow. For a lot of Americans, especially those who'd been dismissed for how they sound, it was more than a defense. It was a declaration. And what about Jessica? She appeared on a follow-up segment 2 nights later. The host tried to lighten the mood. Rough week, huh? Jessica managed a tight smile. Let's just say Senator Kennedy is sharper than he lets on. It was the closest thing to a public concession she'd ever made. But behind the scenes, her team was in damage control mode. Ratings had spiked, but the spike wasn't in her favor. Her usual audience had gone quiet. Her signature smirk now felt like a relic from another era. One advisor suggested she come back with a thick binder for her next appearance. Half joke, half strategy. And she did. Her next show appearance featured her sitting with a meticulously organized folder. Tabs, sticky notes, color-coded highlights. It wasn't just a visual, it was a signal. She'd learned. Not everything, but something. Because the truth Kennedy delivered wasn't just about border policy. It was about assumptions, and what happens when they're finally challenged by someone who doesn't shout, but shows. In Washington, whispers turned to full-blown conversations. Campaign strategists began dissecting the clip, not for messaging, but for method. One analyst summed it up best on a podcast. Open quote, he didn't out-debate her, he out-prepared her, and he never had to raise his voice to do it. Close quote. At a time when yelling had become the currency of political TV, Kennedy flipped the script. He didn't posture, he performed. He didn't aim to destroy, he aimed to clarify. And maybe that's what made it all land so hard. Because sometimes the most powerful form of strength is not the one that shouts the loudest, but the one that stays steady, that answers criticism with evidence and arrogance with elegance. By the end of the week, the full unedited footage was uploaded by the network, a rare move. No added graphics, no spin, just raw tape. And viewers devoured it. They watched frame by frame. They caught the flicker in Jessica's expression when she realized the tide had turned. They watched Kennedy's slow, deliberate movements like scholars analyzing the brushstrokes of a masterpiece. The internet called it a political reckoning, a redefining moment. But to Kennedy, it was just another Tuesday. 3 days after the broadcast, something unexpected happened. The world didn't move on. It leaned in. In a media cycle built to devour attention and discard moments by breakfast, the Kennedy-Tarlov exchange didn't just stick. It grew, it spread, and it echoed. Not because it was explosive, but because it was something far more rare. It was real. There were no dramatic exits, no shouting matches, no insults that could be looped for rage clicks. Instead, what stayed with people was a sentence. A folded piece of paper. A calm voice cutting through noise like a whisper in a crowded room. And it was everywhere. Clips of Kennedy's remarks were now circulating in circles that didn't even follow politics. Instagram reels paired his line, "I may talk slow, but I don't think slow," with quiet footage of farmers, mechanics, veterans, nurses. The soundbite wasn't treated as a takedown anymore. It had become a stand-in, a symbol. For every person who had ever been mocked for how they speak, for those told they weren't smart enough, quick enough, polished enough. Kennedy didn't just win a moment. He opened a door, and people were walking through it. In a VFW hall in Arkansas, a group of veterans watched the clip during a lunch break. One man in his 70s wiped his eyes quietly and said, "I've sounded like that my whole life. Never heard it defended like that." In a classroom in rural Kentucky, a young girl who'd always been too shy to speak up in debate club volunteered to open a discussion. "He sounds like my grandpa," she said, "and my grandpa's the smartest man I know." In Facebook groups, in diner booths, in corners of America that cable news rarely reaches, Kennedy wasn't being praised like a politician. He was being remembered like a moment that meant something. And meanwhile, Kennedy, he didn't tweet a single thing, no hashtag, no quote graphic, no victory lap. He simply returned to work. 3 days later, he held a town hall in a small auditorium in rural Louisiana. The ceiling tiles were stained, the coffee tasted burnt, and the chairs were the kind that folded too easily. But every seat was full, no camera crews, no makeup artists, just people. Kennedy stepped up to the mic with a loose stack of papers and no prepared speech. He greeted folks by name, asked after their families, listened more than he talked. But eventually, someone in the third row, a woman in her 40s with a name tag from a local food bank, stood up and said, "Senator, I saw that show. You didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for us." Kennedy looked down for a moment. Then he looked up, gripped both sides of the podium, and said, "I didn't go on that program to tear anyone down. I went on because we're tired of being talked over, tired of being laughed at because of how we sound or where we're from. Intelligence doesn't come from volume. It doesn't wear a suit and tie. It comes from life, from showing up, listening, and telling the truth, even when it ain't pretty." The room rose, not cheering like a rally, but standing like a prayer. They weren't clapping for a soundbite. They were clapping for recognition. That moment, humble, quiet, untelevised, might have been the most powerful of all. Meanwhile, back in the world of polished studios and curated panels, Jessica Tarlov was undergoing a transformation of her own. No press release, no apology tour. But something had shifted. Her next few appearances were different. The quips were fewer, the interruptions rarer. And when asked about Senator Kennedy again, she simply said, "Next time, I'll bring a binder." The studio chuckled, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that used to follow her sharpest lines. It was softer, a bit uncertain, because deep down even her colleagues knew this wasn't just a TV moment. This was a reckoning. And reckoning doesn't ask for permission. It happens when assumptions meet preparation, when style meets substance, when a smile gets answered by silence. In the weeks that followed, memes exploded, not the mocking kind, the meaningful kind. A photo of Kennedy with his line, "I may talk slow, but I don't think slow," was shared across platforms, sometimes next to pictures of grandparents, veterans, single moms, truck drivers. People were claiming the line not as entertainment, but as identity. And then came the flood of emails to Kennedy's office. Letters, handwritten ones. A 17-year-old girl in West Virginia wrote, open quote, "I've always hated how I speak. My accent made me feel stupid. But now I don't feel that way anymore. Thank you." Close quote. A retired English teacher in Georgia said, open quote, "I taught literature for 35 years. I always told my students, how you say something matters less than what you say. Thank you for reminding the country of that." Close quote. A welder in Oklahoma simply wrote, open quote, "Thanks for talking like one of us." Close quote. But here's the part no one expected. The impact didn't stop at sentiment. It spread into strategy. In political war rooms across the country, consultants began dissecting Kennedy's approach. How did he manage to stay calm under fire? How did he control the room without dominating it? How did he turn a smug jab into a national moment? And one strategist begrudgingly admitted on a panel, open quote, he didn't outperform her. He outgrounded her. That's harder to coach. It's not technique, it's character. Close quote. Back on social media, the unedited version of the exchange was being used in communications classes, literally paused and analyzed like a documentary. Students were asked, what did Jessica assume about her opponent? What mistake did she make? What did Kennedy do differently? One answer echoed across classrooms. Open quote. He didn't perform. He proved. Close quote. And now we come to the final image. 1 week after the panel aired, Kennedy was seen entering a small community library, one of the stops on his rural broadband tour. A local reporter caught him on the way in and asked, "Senator, would you sit across from Jessica again?" Kennedy paused, let out a half smile and said, "Anytime. But next time she might come prepared." It wasn't a jab, it was respect. Because he knew, and so did she, that the next round, if it ever came, would be different. The assumptions were gone, the room had changed, the rules had changed, and maybe that's the legacy of the moment. Not that Kennedy silenced a critic, but that he redefined what smart looks like, what strength sounds like, and what dignity feels like. He reminded a divided country that intelligence doesn't need a coastal accent or a flashy degree. That truth doesn't need to shout. And that when someone underestimates you, the best response is to let the facts speak and let the silence carry them the rest of the way. So the next time someone rolls their eyes at your voice, your pace, your past, let them. Then do what Kennedy did. Speak once, speak clearly, and let the silence do the rest.